introduce the last speaker. And just before we start, the title has to do with Gödel and Giancarlo Rota. And I have commented to Palle that I had a number of occasions to have a brief conversation with Giancarlo Rota. So I'm very interested in finding out what he said about the pernicious influence of mathematics, some advice from Gödel and Rota. So it's a pleasure to present Professor Palle Yourgrau, who's a professor of philosophy at Brandeis University.
Thank you. In effect, this talk is a commentary on Giancarlo Rota's essay, The Pernicious Influence of Mathematics on Philosophy, and also on Kurt Gödel's essay, The Modern Development of the Foundations of Mathematics from a Philosophical Perspective. I borrowed the title of Rota's essay with a slight twist, and indeed not just my title, but my very approach twists somewhat Rota's. The theme of his essay is that mathematics is perfect already in its own peculiar realm, which he describes as a realm of facts, though it might equally be described as a realm of a certain method, the deductive method. And that trouble only starts when what are called analytical philosophers, the descendants of Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Carnap, and Quine, derided by Rota as what he calls mathematizing philosophers, and he means that in a bad sense, apishly trying to imitate the methods, goals, and ideals of mathematics, which he says give the appearance to genuine mathematicians of someone attempting to pay his bills with monopoly money. For Rota, the pernicious influence of mathematics is its illegitimate effect on the mathematizing philosophers. My theme, by contrast, is the pernicious effect of mathematics on thought as such, including and especially the thoughts of those very mathematicians with whom Rota finds no fault. Rota lays the blame for the pernicious effect of mathematics on philosophy solely on the mathematizing philosophers, whereas I think mathematicians themselves must share some of the blame, and not just for the effect mathematics has had on philosophy. I agree with Gödel, then, who argues in his essay that of the two fundamental philosophical worldviews, which he calls, for no reason I can fathom, the leftward direction, which inclines to skepticism, materialism, and positivism, and the rightward, which is in sympathy with metaphysics, religion, and idealism. Mathematics, though it belongs by its nature, mathematics, though it belongs by its nature on the right, according to Gödel, has moved increasingly to the left in response to the zeitgeist. Quote, mathematics, this is Gödel, by its nature as an a priori science, always had in and of itself an inclination to the right. That is toward metaphysics and theology and idealism, and for this reason has long withstood the zeitgeist. End quote. But he continues, around the turn of the 20th century, its hour struck, prompted by the antinomies of set theory, of which we've heard a lot today. Now, I cannot, though it pains me, agree with Javier when he writes in his book, Mathematics and Religion, though it's actually part of a hypothetical, so I'm not sure it's quite fair to attribute it to him, that, quote, mathematics has led the evolution of human rationality across history, end quote. He used the word if, but I'm ignoring that. Through much of history, I cannot say, but from my own very limited experience from the outside, I'm not sure that mathematics takes the lead today, vis-a-vis rationality. Nor do I concur with Rota when he writes that, quote, philosophy's relationship with the goddess reason is closer to forced cohabitation than to the romantic liaison which has always existed between goddess reason and mathematics, end quote. Javier, like Rota, sees mathematics and metaphysics as complementary disciplines, whereas I believe that in an important sense they are in tension. You cannot serve two masters, says Plato. The two masters here, I suggest, are not the realms of mathematics and of metaphysics, but rather the universe of reason versus that of unreason, or mere technique, logos versus alogos. And I do not need to remind this audience that in the opening lines of the Gospel according to John, in the beginning was the Word, The Word was with God, the Word was God. The word translated here as word is, of course, logos. The tension I'm speaking of is not then between competing areas of interest, nor even in modes of investigation, but rather between thoughtfulness and thoughtlessness, insofar as mathematics, I'm afraid, all too often discourages thinking. Not just thinking about metaphysics, thinking as such. To a considerable extent, I believe mathematics as it is currently practiced is bad for one's mental health. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, and I don't mean to include this audience. But actually, it's not really, it's only partly a joke. It's only partly a joke. God's mercy preserves mathematics from being drowned in mere technique, wrote the great French philosopher Simone Weil. If only this were true. Unfortunately, I believe God's mercy is still much needed in this domain. Why am I saying these things? A training in mathematics gives one all too often the illusion that mathematics is just a practice in deduction. That fits logic better than mathematics, but it's actually wrong about both mathematics and logic, as Rota himself emphasizes, and as Javier has emphasized. He attributes the misunderstanding to the, quote, mathematizing philosophers, that mathematics is just deduction, but I think all too often mathematics itself, judging from my many students who come to me straight from their mathematics classes in Brandeis, it encourages this mistake. I hear this all the time from my students. Mathematics, that's just deduction. Again, Javier himself is quite clear as a mathematician that deduction or proof is only a part of mathematics, but deduction remains, I think for all too many, inside and outside mathematics, the primary aspect of the field. Mathematics thus all too often gives the impression that all knowledge is ultimately based on proof. For Gödel, this is one of the illusions of positivism. This is false, of course, even for mathematics itself. Proof obviously rests on unproved, indeed unprovable axioms and methods of proof. It is often said, I've read this many times, it is often said that Gödel proved that not everything in mathematics can be proved. We don't need Gödel to achieve this obvious insight. We will need Gödel later, but not for this. Okay. Mathematics all too often seems to project the paradigm of complete axiomatizability as in Euclid's ideal, captured in the modern concept from Frege, Hilbert, Turing, and others of a formal system. Here we do need Gödel. His famous incompleteness theorem demonstrates conclusively that that ideal, complete axiomatizability, is an illusion. Mathematics, as Plato was the first to notice, rests ultimately on non-mathematical foundations. The palace of mathematics does not rest on the foundations of a super palace, but rather on something very different from the palace itself. Hilbert attempted a compromise, hoping to prove that a safe and secure part of mathematics, what he called the finitary part, finite, that's not finite, that's a technical term, finitary, could serve as the ultimate foundation for the rest. Gödel's two incompleteness theorems shattered Hilbert's dream. Now, a little side note. As a footnote to Gödel in the leftward direction of the zeitgeist, it is noteworthy that in current debates as to whether evolution provides a complete account of all facets of human life and experience, including the sense of beauty, and listen to what Paul said earlier today and previously, it appears that the ideological purists among evolutionists, which seems to be most of them, have an almost religious conviction that there cannot possibly more to evolution than random, undirected mutations that aid survival. Any suggestion of a filter or pattern or a higher order law of nature, not to say intelligent design, is dismissed as, quote, unscientific. Indeed, any attempt even to challenge or modify the theory of evolution is considered unscientific. To adapt a wonderful phrase from Gödel, these so-called extreme empiricists turn out to be a priorists with the sign reversed. That is to say, they appear to have an a priori belief that the empirical theory of evolution cannot in any way be modified. In particular, they have a kind of religious devotion. I'm using the word now in the negative sense. A kind of religious devotion to the idea that evolution is in the strongest sense mindless. As Gödel said, quote, Materialism is inclined to regard the world as an unordered and therefore